Before we move forward and elaborate more on permissions and privacy, I want to do a practical demonstration of what the implications are of these different permissions and privacy settings. We're going to use the backend and some of the stuff that we learned about the backend so far in order to do this demo. So let's head to our backend and go into the code panel. And I'm going to go here to backend and public. And let's create a new web module. And I'll call this web module Playground. And here we're going to just write some code in order to play around with our new collection and its data permissions. In order to interact with our new collection, I am going to be using the Wix Data APIs. So let's go ahead and import that library, import Wix Data from Wix Data. This is a library that we can use both in the backend and the front end of our website equally. And here we're going to make some changes to the default web method that we got with the file. So I'm going to call this web method test permissions. And I'm going to leave it for permissions.anyone. So anybody can call this web method from the front end. And any restrictions that we have in terms of the data access will be based on the access that we set inside of our collection. So here in terms of parameters, I'm going to not pass any parameters. And what we're going to do is we are going to run a data query on our new collection. So I'm going to say here Wix data dot query. And the collection ID, if you remember, is example. Again, if you ever forget what the collection ID is, we can always go over here to our databases and copy the collection ID from right over here. I like to do that often because I forget or misspell the name of the collection and then have to do a lot of debugging just for a typo. So I'm going to run a query here. So wixdata.query and .find. Okay, so really a very, very simple data query, which should return items that we have in that collection. And we can call this test permissions function from the front end. So let's go ahead and copy the name of this web method. And we're going to go here back to our home page. And we're going to need to, first of all, import this from the backend. So we're going to import our new function from backend / playground.web. And here in the Start Now button, instead of calling our add function from our previous demonstration, I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm going to say instead that const result equals to await test permissions. And then we are going to log the result. So log console.log result, not result, but result, and result. Awesome. So we did a very quick conversion of the purpose of our Start Now button. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to publish this site and test and see what happens when I try and click on this Start Now button. A quick reminder that currently our collections permissions, if we go over here to the CMS and we check here permissions and privacy, this is another way to access this panel. So we can see here that it's currently set to show content, probably because I forgot to save our custom access that we set up before. So let me just return it to our custom access. So currently it's set to be admin only for everything. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click Save. And I'm going to publish the site and head over to the live site to see what happens when I try and access this collection as a regular site visitor. Here on the live site, I've already opened up the console log panel. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to click Start Now. And you can see here that we have an error. Okay, I can't really see what this error is because this error is occurring in the back end of our website. But you can see here that I obviously did not manage to gain access to the data. On the other hand, if I was to go back into our editor and head over here to our backend file, and instead run a test here using functional testing. So I'm just going to go ahead and click play and run. Then you should see here that we did manage to query the data. So this is what the response to a data query looks like. And we didn't encounter any permissions issues. Okay, so this highlights a very important piece of information that I mentioned earlier, that whenever we are working within the editor, we have admin power. Okay, so even if we set all of our collections to be admin only, when I'm running my functional testing, when I'm viewing my site in preview mode, I will have admin access. And so it's not a good evaluation of whether a standard user will be able to use the site in a certain way. So whenever we have collections with certain permissions and we're dealing with access levels, we always need to test on either our live site or a test site in order to make sure that it is behaving as we want. Now that we understand what it looks like when we don't have permission to access the collection, let's go ahead and give permissions for anybody to view the content so that I can access it as an anonymous visitor to the website. So I'm going to go over here to our code panel, and I'm going to go here to permissions and privacy, and I'm going to change the view permissions to everyone. Okay, so everyone can view the data in this collection now. And I'm going to go ahead and publish my site with these changes. And once that's published, we can head over to the live site and see what the experience is like there. So just switching over to the live site, I'm going to refresh the page. Don't forget to refresh after publishing to get the most updated version of your site. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Start Now. And you can see here now that I did get the result of the query, okay, because of the permissions and how they were set. So this is an example of how setting the permissions can affect the access to data from both the back end and the front end. Now I want to demonstrate what will happen if we use something called suppress auth. For the purpose of this demonstration, I am going to return our privacy permissions and privacy settings to admin only. Okay, so again, we have admin access only for our entire collection. In addition, I am going to set up a query of the data collection from the front end. So I'm going to go over here to our home page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import Wix data here as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say we're going to have result backend. Okay, so that's going to be over here, result backend. And we're also going to have a result from the front end. So what I'm going to say here is const result front end equals to await Wix data dot query example dot find. Okay, so this is a query from the front end, which means that our default permissions will take effect. I'm just going to log that result as well. So console.log. Let's call this result front end. And this will be result front end. Let me just change the log here so that we understand that this is the result from the back end. And last but not least, I'm going to make a final change inside of our backend file. So let me go here back to Playground. And here within the find parentheses, I'm going to add options. And one of these options that I'm going to add is something called suppress auth. And basically what that means is ignore all of the collection permissions. Query as if you're an admin. So regardless of what the permissions are on the collection, this backend function, this backend query will always run as if we're an admin, which means that we should always be able to access the data that we need or make any updates, changes that we need to the data collection. So let me go ahead and publish these, and we're going to head back to the live site just to see what happens now. On the live site, I'm going to go ahead and click the Start Now button. And you can see here that we got the results from the backend. So even though our permissions are set to be admin only, because we're suppressing auth in the backend, something by the way that we can only do in the backend, we can't use suppress auth in the front end, we gain access to the data. On the other hand, in terms of our front end result, we currently don't see it here in the logs, but if I go here to errors, then you'll see that we have this error. Okay, so we're saying we don't have permission to access that collection because we're not suppressing auth in any way, and we're just a regular visitor to the site, and we don't have admin access to the collection. So let's go ahead and discuss what the implications are of this suppress auth and what scenarios we might want to use it in. Why might we need to use suppress auth when we have permissions both in our web methods and in terms of our access to data? Two classic reasons that we might want to use suppress auth. One is that the current permissions on Wix collections don't allow nuanced access to data beyond the 4 permission levels that they've defined. So we have visitor, member, item owner, and admin. There are many scenarios where we might want to allow access to data based on a more nuanced permission level, such as, is somebody a certain member role? Do they have a certain value entered in a certain field in a certain collection? Do they have a subscription? Have they bought a certain product before? Etc., etc., etc. Okay, so we might have nuanced access that we want to provide beyond the default levels that Wix gives in the permissions. And that is one classic reason that we would want to use suppress auth. Essentially, what that would allow us to do is enter our own custom logic over here. So we can get the member info, check that they have the certain role that we want them to have, that they bought the certain product that we wanted them to buy, and only after that, expose the data to them by suppressing the admin authorization and not setting the permissions, for example, to members only, because any member would be able to access it regardless if they fulfilled the criteria that we defined. Another classic scenario where we might want to use suppress auth is if we have a collection that has varying levels of data permission. And I'm going to talk about this a little more later on when we talk about how to build the architecture of your data collections and the relationships between them. But let's assume for a moment that we have a data collection that contains multiple levels of private data. So it could also contain public data. It could contain a little bit of private data. It could contain data that should be accessible to different levels of people based on their role, and all of this is all in the same data collection. So for example, if we have a profiles collection for a user, then we might have some public profile data there, such as their username or some pictures that they uploaded and they want everybody to see, but we might also have some private data there, such as their email or their address, and we might have data there that's only accessible to some people, like a paying member, maybe some special posts or something along those lines. So you might be thinking, oh, maybe we want to separate those into separate collections, and that's a valid thought that we'll talk about later on. But let's assume for a moment that we've decided in terms of our collection architecture to include a collection that has data that would require mixed permissions. In this case, we also cannot use the default Wix permissions and privacy for our data collections because we want to allow nuanced access. So for example, we might decide to go ahead and query the collection Okay, so for example, here we'd say const result equals to await, and we'd need to turn this into an asynchronous function here, like that. So we would get the data from the collection with admin access, and then later on, we would decide which data we are actually sending to the end user based on what we understand about their roles and permissions, and etc. Okay, so that is another classic example for when we would want to have admin permissions only and suppress auth. And when we're building web applications, these things actually come quite often. So my default mindset is usually to set everything to admin only, unless it's a collection which clearly can be, let's say, for example, viewed by everyone, or should have members can add or something along those lines. But again, in most scenarios, I would set to admin only for everything and set up nuanced data access as I described here via the backend.